Hey, what's up? Grandmaster Igor Smirnov is here, and today we're going to be talking about the London system, which is the setup for white, a highly popular and very universal opening system that many players keep playing over and over again. So whether you're one of those players who use the London system yourself, or whether you need to know how to play against it while you're playing black, this video is right for you. So today I'd like to share with you a really cool system that you can use as black against the London system. So when white plays pawn d4, and let's say you respond knight to f6, usually a white player would play bishop f4 because that's the beginning of their setup. They're now ready to push their pawn to e3 once their bishop is out there and not restricted by that pawn chain. And after that, they're going to play pawn c3 and completely lock this rock solid pawn chain in the center of the board, which makes it really difficult for black to get any active play. And that's why so many players love playing this as white, and that's why we always struggle facing it as black. But today I've prepared for you quite an unknown opening line, which is aggressive. That's what I love about this. Even though it's been used even by Garry Kasparov, most players are completely unaware of it, and hey, you can get great results with it. But first, just a couple words once again. Normally, things go something like that. You play pawn d5 or any other move, and white players would play, let's say, knight f3, and after that, e6, e3, white would get this London system set up, and they're going to be playing these universal moves. So basically, regardless of what black does, they're going to be putting this setup on the board, and yeah, since those players keep playing the same opening setup over and over again in all the games that they play, they got a lot of experience with it. And again, it's a really stubborn system that is really difficult for black to get any active play, to even figure out how can you possibly attack white here. And that's why it's such an annoying to play as black against the London system. Alright, now let's come back, and I'm going to share with you the line that I've prepared for you today, how you can change things for the better for you and how you can get a lot more aggressive setup. If you just want to know a little more about the London system in general, I've got an introductory video about this where I share the general opening theory and some traps which are necessary to know if you're playing the London system, so you may check this out later. And right now let's dive deeper into the system that I would like to share with you for today's video. So to white goes pawn d4, whereas pawn knight f6, white goes bishop f4, so far everything's standard, but here you play the move pawn c6. And I really love this, because here, by playing pawn c6, the black's idea is to play queen b6 and to take aim at this pawn on b2. Even though at first you may think, hey, but normally in an opening you shouldn't put your queen out there too early, it can be attacked. It's quite correct, and it's good if you are aware of this rule. But there is also another rule, which states that in an opening you need to develop knights before bishops, and white just violated that rule by developing the bishop too early. So by using this aggressive approach, you're kind of showing to the white player that, hey, I know that you're violating opening rules, and I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to attack you. And so this queen b6 move is actually quite annoying. Now, in this position, white would either play e3 or maybe develop the knight. It doesn't really matter. Again, what's good about this opening is that you're playing also kind of a setup. You'll see that even though I'm going to share a couple of variations and show you how you can play in different sub-variations of this opening, but basically you're just going to be playing the same moves over and over again, regardless of what white does. So it's a pretty cool system for black. Now, so you play queen b6 now, you attack this pawn on b2, and even though it looks like a very simple threat for white to parry, it's actually quite annoying. Because, for example, how do they do this? How can they possibly protect this pawn? If they play queen c1, it's quite a passive and dull move, and normally you don't want to use such a powerful piece for such a lousy function of just defending this little pawn on b2. So that already feels like some sort of a accomplishment for black, forcing white to play such a passive move. And the queen there, in the long run, will also stand in the way of the white's rook, so it breaks the white's harmony here, and therefore queen c1 normally is not the move that white wants to play. Now let's think if there's anything else that white can do. Well, they can also just play pawn b3, and yes, that solves the problem, but it actually breaks entirely or almost entirely the white's complete setup, because the whole point of the London system was not to move the b pawn here, right? It was actually to build this rock solid pawn chain like that, where all the pawns are defending each other so nicely that there is just nothing you can do about that, right? And so b3 in this context is not the move that a white player wants to play, because if they, in addition to that, have the pawn on b3, let's just move this around and play pawn b3 to defend the pawn, now they have all these holes along this diagonal, all these weaknesses, all these dark squares are weak, And because their bishop is out there on f4, these squares are kind of weak. If their bishop would be still on the c1, they would be able to fianchetto it and fill in the gaps, and they would be alright. But because the bishop is already on another square, all these holes on the queen side are weak, all these dark squares, and we're going to take advantage of them. Therefore, all in all, so even though it looks like white can defend the pawn easily, whatever they do, there are some major drawbacks, and we're going to keep punching and keep taking advantage of those weaknesses. Okay, anyway, let's start with the most popular response of white, the move pawn b3. Then you respond pawn d6, and this creates the second, or rather starts the second plan of black. Because in addition to taking advantage of this weak pawn along the b-file, which we already did, the other thing which we're going to do here to play aggressively is to try to take advantage of the advanced and at the same time exposed position of this bishop out there on f4. And what we're going to do is to bring our knight over there to h5 and to attack this bishop and try to capture that. Now, some players may think, hey, it's not a win of a piece, it's just an exchange. Why would you spend time doing that? Well, it's true, it is an exchange, but actually a bishop is a bit stronger piece than a knight. So if you can force an exchange like that, you are kind of winning this exchange. You're winning a little bit of material advantage over this kind of an exchange. So they're approximately equal pieces, but not exactly, because bishop is stronger. Also, again, since white has all these weaknesses over there, if you can also eliminate the dark squared bishop who could possibly defend those weak squares, all these dark squared weaknesses will become a painful problem for white throughout the entire game. So that's why we'll play pawn d6 now, taking away one of the squares where the bishop could go and preparing this knight h5 move. And after white plays knight f3, now we are free to play knight h5. Because the move knight f3 not only developed a knight, which is good for white, but there is also a little downside. It actually blocks the white's queen diagonal out there, so you can now land your knight on h5 and it cannot be captured anymore. So we can play knight h5 with the intent to capture the bishop. And the bishop will be captured. Now there is no way for the bishop to escape. Normally your opponent will play bishop g3. After that, you're going to trade the bishop and we're going into the main line of this variation. If your opponent tries to be tricky and instead of bishop g3 tries to play bishop g5 and trying to save the bishop that way, that doesn't really change things too much because your plan, your setup is going to be the same. It's just that you'll need to keep chasing the bishop, playing h6. Once the bishop goes back, you keep chasing it with the move pawn g5. And now, if they finally go to g3, we got pretty much the same position that we have in the main line. You're going to trade the bishop and all's good. Now, if they don't play bishop g3, there is the final trick that they may try against you. Instead of moving the bishop back, they may play knight d2, saying, hey, if you take my bishop, I'm going to take your knight, but also that'll destroy your pawn chain on the king side. And maybe the queen can collect this weak pawn in the future. But in that case, you aren't going to take the bishop right away. You just need to continue the maneuver a little further. So you play knight g7, you can hide your knight, now the bishop is forced to go, and then the knight comes back to f5. So finally, get into the bishop, and now there is finally no way for the bishop to escape, and you will capture it. The white's knight on d2, that move that they played, knight f3 going to d2, that was kind of a waste of time because the knight in d2 is passive anyway. It's also blocking the way out for the other knight. Therefore, the fact that white moved the knight there is rather bad for white, so it's not that white achieved anything here. Alright, coming back to the main line, now we can see that even though the white's bishop may possibly run around for a little while, it's not going to change things too much, and ultimately you will trade it anyway. Therefore, most players just play the simple move bishop g3. And now you can go ahead and take the bishop, which is great. Pawn takes, and now you play another key move in this whole setup, that's the move pawn g6. We talked about previously that white has a lot of weaknesses along those dark squares. And by putting your bishop out there on this long diagonal, you are going to take aim at all these weak squares, maybe even the white's rook in the future. And of course, right now there is the white's pawn there in the center of the board, which blocks the diagonal, but we're going to undermine it, and hey, you're going to attack all these weaknesses in the future. In addition to that, playing g6 has a nice defensive role as well, because if white plays bishop d3, which is part of the white's normal setup in the London system, then without that pawn on g6, the white's rook and bishop could possibly team up against that pawn on h7, right, if the pawn were on g7. But with the pawn on g6, that's not a problem for you at all, because now the pawn blocks the diagonal of the bishop, therefore it's not a problem anymore, and now you can just play bishop g7. There is no attack that white can possibly execute here, so nothing to worry about. Now, let's say white goes knight d2, again, standard London system, and then you play pawn c5. Another very key and thematical move here, because after the move pawn c5, we want to open up the diagonal for the bishop so that it can hit the rook and all these weaknesses. So white will normally play pawn c3, that's how they played in London system. And now you can just continue your development, or you can castle, and actually any normal moves will now give you a great position, because now this pawn on c3 is weak, and basically it's now hard for white to come up with any meaningful plan. So even if you just play standard developing moves, your position is going to be great. For example, you can castle. Even though there is the white's rook here, which seemingly looks towards the black's king, it cannot do anything really. So there is nothing white can do. If they try knight g5 to attack you, just play pawn h6, and yeah, there is nothing white can do. The knight will have to go back anyway, so that's not a problem. Let's take this move back. We don't have to worry about that. And if not that, then yeah, white would probably have to castle themselves. And now, even though you could play knight c6 or bishop g4, both moves are perfectly fine, there are subtle problems here for you that maybe white can go knight c4 and hit your queen that way. Or if you develop your knight out here to c6, maybe white could consider playing pawn d5, attacking the knight. And to stop those both moves from happening, like either white going knight c4 or white pushing the pawn forward to d5, I think the easiest approach for black is just to play the move pawn d5. That pawn on d6 already was used to trade off the white's dark square bishop, right? Now the dark square bishop is gone, you don't need the pawn there anymore, so you may just push it forward, having the most classical setup in all the positions of the queen's gambit, where you have these pawns on d5 and c5. Right now with this d5 pawn, white can never play knight c4, so you don't have to worry about that, and you're building up these nice pawns in the center of the board. And after that, if they go queen e2, you just continue your development, bishop g4, then whatever they do, you go knight c6, and you're getting actually a great game. So if, let's say, white goes rook d1, or again, any other standard move, there is a lot that you can do here. Anytime you want, you can strike in the center with the move e5, very powerful. You can also play queen a5 at some point, and, take aim at those weaknesses on the queen side. Or you could just bring your own rooks to the middle of the board, play rook c8, and also try to use that along the c-file. All in all, you're having a great position with two bishops, strong center, a lot of active ideas, and it's quite unclear what white is going to be doing here. So I would definitely say that black kind of gained the upper hand in this opening. By the way, there was a really funny line here where both players are trying hard to outsmart each other, and it finishes spectacularly, but I'm going to show it in just a moment. So before that, let's finish with this line. So after d4, again, we go knight f6, they, let's say, go bishop f4, and as soon as they get the bishop out, we play pawn c6, trying to play queen b6, taking advantage of this pawn, which lost the defense. Now after white plays e3 or whatever, we go queen b6, and so far we analyzed what to do if white goes pawn b3, right? Now, what if they go queen c1? The second way for white to defend the pawn. Actually, your plan does not change at all. You're going to be doing all the same stuff, but there is a subtle difference here. Since the white's queen here is not on c1 anymore, and it does not cover that square on h5, you can go knight h5 immediately, without any waiting or preparation. You can just go there right away, hunting for the bishop. And as the bishop goes back, nothing really changes, you just capture it. Now, here's a quick question for you. What if bishop goes bishop g5 here? How would you play here as black? Please think about this and write it down in the comments below. How would you proceed here as black? But now let's come back to the main line. Bishop g3, knight takes, pawn takes, g6, all the same stuff. Knight f3, bishop g7, we fianchetto the bishop. After that, we play pawn c5, trying to open up this diagonal so that the bishop and as well as the queen can start attacking there. So it's certainly better for white not to trade pawns, but to defend it while playing pawn c3. And another good thing for black in this operation is that you don't have to play pawn d6 at all, because you already traded off the white's dark square bishop. So you may just play pawn d5 in one go without playing d6 first. So that's kind of an improvement for black comparing to the previous variation. And let's say after knight d2, it's all the same stuff. You go knight c6, you castle, and then in the future you're probably going to be playing bishop g4, playing a rook in the center of the board. At some point you're going to strike in the center with the move pawn e5, and you're having this active position. Again, it's hard to say what does white have here. Not much really. White is having a passive defensive position, and you easily kind of out-tricked black. Well, not easily, but just because you know this powerful opening line. I saw that many kind of fighting style grandmasters played this, even though it's certainly not a mainstream line, and like percentage-wise, very few people actually know this line as black, but now you are prepared. Okay, now let me show you that cool variation that I've been talking about previously. Now in this position that we analyzed so far, instead of playing the move which we talked about, Queen b6, hitting the white's pawn over there on b2, some players decided to be tricky and they played the move pawn g5. So what's the hope for black? Well, if white is seduced by the pawn sacrifice and they grab it, they can go queen a5, winning the bishop right away. It's not such an obvious tactics, therefore it may work. Now let's come back. So that's the first way black tried to trick white and to win the game immediately. If white goes bishop g3, now black says, hey, okay, I can go knight e4 this time and, hunt for the bishop and win it right away. Cool, without, again, any extra preparation for black. But here, white player said, hey, but I also want to outsmart you. Since now you haven't played d6 yet, I may play my bishop out there on e5 and not only escape from the attack, but also attack the black's rook out there on h8. But now it's time for the black player to think, hey, I got you. Even though it's true, I can just play pawn f6, kicking the bishop away, forcing it to go back, and it's all cool. But then all of a sudden, instead of retreating with the bishop back, white goes queen h5, check, boom, and it's actually checkmate. And what's funny is that this line happened in many games, even though played by relatively strong players. So it's just a funny variation how both players tried hard to outsmart each other, but it all finished with checkmate in 6 moves. Quite funny. And by the way, I gotta say that my cat just asked me to tell you that he's not dead or tired, he just wants to avoid unnecessary actions, which is smart. Oh, besides that, if you want to know more about the London system, then you can click right there to check out my video about the essential theory and traps of the London system. Also, you may click over there and attend my free masterclass, and who knows, maybe you'll become a master or even grandmaster one day. Talk to you soon, take care.